What does it take to be a transformative leader in today's buzzing world? Is it about titles and hierarchies, or is it more organic, like a hive?
And what's harder for adults than learning is unlearning.
Think of it more as a hive where everybody's working together, shared goals, shared vision.
Today, I'm thrilled to introduce two people. First, let's meet Katie Desiderio, who challenges us to unlearn to improve as leaders.
As humans, right, to sometimes it's easy to point the finger, but it's harder to turn the mirror to be like, oh, what am I doing? How am I influencing this?
We also have Michael G. Frito. He's got this awesome way of blending theory and practice, and he helps us to see leadership as a collective effort rather than something that's top down.
And the Beekeeper allows this environment where they can just get right in there. It's not much different from what leaders need to be doing.
Welcome to the School Leaders Project, a podcast series dedicated to helping school leaders make positive changes in their schools and communities. The School Leaders Project is an initiative by Toddle, your all-in-one teaching and learning platform made for teachers and by teachers. Toddle offers a truly integrated experience, so all of your big picture curriculum planning flows seamlessly into day-to-day instruction, assessment, reporting, and even parent communications. Toddle started as a passion project in a school that thought that teaching tech should be as innovative as teaching teams, and we're now loved by more than 1,500 progressive K-12 schools all around the world. Without further ado, let's jump into this amazing and buzzing conversation with Katie and Mike. Katie and Michael, I'm so excited to have you on the show today. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, Cindy, thanks for having us.
So I'd love to kind of kick off by just letting our audience get to know you a little bit. So who are you both? What's the work that you do that you're passionate about that gives your life meaning?
I think for Katie and I, it's probably so similar. We love helping other human beings and learn and grow. I know that the space that I'm in at work is all about leadership development, professional development, and empowering people to do their best work. And so that's kind of what drives me each and every day.
Yeah. And just to kind of echo that, Mike and I met in our doctoral program. And so in the spirit of, getting the listeners to learn about us, we've been on kind of a learning journey together. And so we met as students, right, in that space of learning. And then in the professional space, we recognized, to Mike's point, that we had this alignment really that ties back to our discipline of, human performance at work. And so we started writing together in the academic space. And so probably, over a decade after we had been writing in that academic space, we came to, where we are today with the launch of the book.
Very cool. Yeah. So you specialize in change management. Is that right? Transformational change management in schools?
So change management is a piece of, right, the leadership development work, but really, the sole focus of our work. I work in higher education at Moravian University. Mike's in industry, but it's all on human performance at work. And so to your point, change management, transformation, right, that's all part of effective leadership. And so especially post-pandemic, we're seeing a lot of how do we hit that refresh? What's the undertone of how we encourage ongoing learning and growth in the space of transformation? And so a lot of that inspired a lot of how we wrote the book.
That makes sense. Well, and some of this work for me, it feels like when I think about change management in schools, you mentioned COVID, it often accompanies crises or challenges. So are you guys kind of the ones putting out the fires when you come in, or what's your experience with that?
Yeah, I think, from a change management perspective, especially in schools, I think there's a lot of translatable frameworks and behaviors that organizations or schools can do to help leaders navigate these difficult times. And change management is not easy. So I think a lot of for what we do is we talk about the culture and helping, think about how do we change the culture? How do we transform the culture to make people, more receptive to change and building a trusting environment. So when change does happen and things do occur, that people understand the why behind the change.
Yeah. And I think to Mike's point, and Cindy, going back to, the role that we play, I think a lot about, my now 9-year-old going through kindergarten in a virtual space, and those teachers right? Being able to adapt and respond and still create safe learning environments, to Mike's point, right? Where trust is present and there's reciprocity, right? Of the teacher and learner. And now, right, coming back to like authoring our new norm. And so very much in the space of the work that we're doing, it's about like, being able to pause and like look around, listen, right, with an open heart and open mind to get the climate of where we are, because things have changed. People have changed, right? People's needs have changed in that space of how we learn. And so there's an undertone of, how we're able to be agile. And in the book, there's a draw to, we're not going to do things the way that we've always done it. And what's harder for adults than learning is unlearning.
Yes.
And so, right. So, and Mike and I are challenged in this way every day. People are like, well, you're subject matter experts. And we're like, right. But we're not effective unless we're stopping to say like, oh, I can't do that anymore. That's not effective. I'm unintentionally standing in my own way or of the people around me. And so how do we unlearn the habits and things that aren't working and replace those with new habits that help us in that space of change and transformation? And that's really difficult for adults to do.
So hard. And there's such a gap between the knowing and the doing. Like we all maybe know the changes we want to make, but actually taking those changes can be so hard. Yeah. I wonder if either of you or both of you could share a story of success that you've had with change management. One that like you can hang your head on and you're like, it really worked. This was an aha moment when I was working with the team.
Yeah, no, I think one of the ones that jumps out at me is from a communication standpoint. I think as organizations get bigger or growth is occurring, whether it's at a school or an organization, I think having the ability to understand how to communicate and build relationships is extremely important. Oftentimes that's an overlooked skill set, soft skill. And one of the big changes I think that resonated with me was starting at the top from a cultural kind of transformation perspective on how we learn to communicate with others better, to kind of see the best ways to create effective, meaningful relationships. And oftentimes people forget it starts with, you as a human being and you as an individual to look at yourself and say, like, who am I? How do I want to be communicated with? But also then looking at others and saying, well, how do they want to be communicated with as well? And so that's probably one of the biggest change, management experiences that I've seen recently is helping build better, effective communication.
So what Mike is illuminating without saying, right, explicitly is the platinum rule, right? And so when we come down to, this idea of unlearning, we've asked our readers and listeners to unlearn the golden rule, right? People don't want to be treated the same way you do. Mm-hmm. And so to Mike's point, when we're being effective through transformation and change management, we're enacting the platinum rule. We're listening to understand. We're identifying those deep level diversity differences among us. We're creating safe spaces where diversity of thought and voice are heard and considered. And then people feel more tied to the purpose and way forward in the work you're doing. And so you're able to then get buy-in in that space of building a guiding coalition to make the change stick.
So our listeners might be familiar with the golden rule: treat others as you'd like to be treated. Can you just tell us again, what's the platinum rule?
Yeah, sure. Great question. So the platinum rule is to treat others as they want to be treated. And so it illuminates, right, the example that Mike gave, right, is that we're considering those things that we can't see, but those deep level diversity attributes among us, right, that actually make us better, right? We're brighter, better, richer, stronger when we're able to bring in diverse, thoughts and voice and perspectives to help us in that way forward.
Love that. Okay, we've got to dive into your book, because I was joking with Mike before we started recording that your book is blowing up, guys. It's everywhere. It's on the list of leadership books to read. I saw in another keynote that you gave, this book began as, wasn't it on a napkin or a scrap of paper that you wrote it out, right? So tell us title of your book, why you wrote it, let's hear about it, the story of the book.
Sure. Yeah. So the book's called The Beekeeper, Pollinating Your Organization for Transformative Growth. And to your point, like, we're super humbled about the response that it's gotten, across a lot of different industries, not just schools, but industry as well. But yeah, it's, really, really funny story. Katie and I, like she mentioned, we've been writing together for many years, and we kind of had an aha moment maybe a couple years ago where, she was going up for full professor at her university. We talked about, maybe writing a book instead of a paper. And so we had both been in Chicago for different reasons. I was there for work. She was there for her, her consulting work. And we ended up saying, we got to get together. We hadn't seen each other in a while. We live thousands of miles apart. And so we grabbed, Chicago pizza. We got talking about what this book could look like. And we did. We mapped it out on the back of a pizza box. In fact, we still have the pizza box. We kept it.
Frame it.
And yeah, that's what started. We thought of the bee as something that is a pollinator that provides growth for everything around us, right? The food we eat, the flowers, nature, and we said, wow, man, that's such an interesting concept. How, why can't we take the lessons from the bee and try to apply it to organizational culture? And as researchers, Katie and I really at that moment, we're thinking about it. We're like, what do we do? How do we research this? And 18 days after that meeting, it ended up being UN World Bee Day. And it hit our news feed and we were like, oh my gosh, this is a universe moment.
Yeah.
Like we got to do something. So we just, she booked some, experiences with some beekeepers. We went out and we learned from, beekeepers on what they do, how do they create thriving hives? What's the role of the bee? What's the role of the beekeeper? And we started mapping out what the book could look like from there.
So you had the idea first, and then did the bee metaphor come up, or was it the bee from the start?
Yeah, so we actually started in like a more traditional sense, and the bee came in after we had been talking about like what could a book look like. But to Cindy, it was also like we were in that space of like being present. It's easy for us as researchers who've been writing in traditional, academic journals for over a decade to say, well, no, of course, we'll write this as a traditional leadership book. But post-pandemic, we recognized that storytelling was something that was really resonating with people in the space of motivating action and behavior change. And so that's where we were like simultaneously talking about how could we write a story or a fable? And then where do bees, right? So it was like us just getting out of our own way to say like, what could this be? Pun intended. Yeah. And it kind of like came to us, but I think that's really, for Mike and I, a lot of like the work that we've done have come from those, like, let's just kind of get messy in our thinking and our, ideas and the things that maybe we're not thinking about. And how do we kind of start on a blank canvas and really on the back of a pizza box, kind of drawing out, how this could kind of grow into something. And then to Mike's point, when we saw it was UN World Bee Day, we were like, this was meant to be. We have to go forward. Yeah.
So you said you spent some time around bees, like with beekeepers. What were some of the ahas that you had immersing yourself in the bee culture? Yeah.
So we both have, we've done experiences together. We've kind of visited local, local beekeepers, just to talk to them. And I think the one thing that you learn, at least the one thing I learned, and I'll let Katie chime in after, is that the beekeeper is really responsible for the success of the hive. And they are the ones that ensure that hive has everything that needs to, create the environment where the bees can be productive, right? They can work together, they can collaborate, it provides stability for the hive. And if you think about really what the beekeeper does, it's not much different from what leaders need to be doing in organizations to ensure that the people that work at a school, that work at a company, leaders can get out of their way and let the people do their best work, but just create the environment that allows them to do that.
It's amazing to watch the beekeepers in action in kind of just knowing how they need to, right, keep this environment. And so I'll give the example of, most recently, this beekeeper that's really inspired a lot of Mike and my learning about beekeeping was kind of like preparing us that like at this stage in the year, she needs to be thinking about, are the bees ready to sustain the winter? And when she opens up and she's looking right through the hive, she needs to see how many eggs the queen is laying, right? And is the queen doing her job, right, to make sure that they're sustaining what they need to make it through the winter. And so to watch this analysis happen just kind of very nonchalantly, right, and looking at, is this hive ready to sustain the cold months, right? It was kind of like we had all of these transferable, right, examples of like how we see these things in organizations, but how we were able to make decisions right? And movement of like, no, this hive will not make it on its own. And now I need to combine because as I'm going into September, right, I need to acclimate 2 hives to make sure it's strong enough, right, to sustain the winter or change or those variables that we can't necessarily predict. And so in so many ways, right, is like kind of looking at that from the lens of like, how are we agile when we get the climate of what's happening and how we could make those decisions to make sure, right, that we're strong together.
Because as leaders, our environment goes through seasons as well, and we have to be adaptive to that. So what a beautiful and kind of iterative metaphor that just keeps giving. That's cool. Yep. So let's dive into the heart of it. So you advocate for a transformative leadership approach. So if I'm a leader, how might transformative leadership be similar or different to other leadership styles?
Yeah, so I think the we don't want to necessarily say that we're different than other leadership styles, but building on and really using the tri-level of leadership as that guide. And so the tri-level of leadership is individual, right? That's each of us here, right? And for listeners, that's you. The group level, that's us working with and through one another. And then at the macro level, right, the organization. And so sometimes where we fail in effective leadership is starting at that individual level. Leadership starts with you. And so there's a sense of vulnerability to be able to turn the mirror to say, how do I show up? How do I impact people? How do I make people feel after an interaction with me? Do I recognize that I have the agency to hold the pen and author my leadership story in ways that align with my goals, right? We get to choose who and how we want to be, which is why every chapter is a B mindset. And so we have these choices as humans, but then there's that transfer in transformation of then how I, right, impact the group level. And each of us have that subjective, right, opportunity to impact the whole. And so sometimes we forget, right, either that we have the agency or we forget the process of like, let me look at me first. And then, right, how do I effectively work with others? And so we watch Catherine, the protagonist in the book, do this, right? Like she has these aha moments and awareness moments of herself, seemingly going on a vacation that she didn't want to go on, right? That she thought really wasn't going to be a vacation. But when she allowed herself to be open, right? Mind, heart, right? Listening to understand and then learning unexpectedly from this beekeeper, we start to see some things change in her thinking and her approach.
Well said. I mean, I think we are building on a lot of the existing leadership theories and kind of, as leaders, it's less about a hierarchical kind of approach. We kind of encourage people to think of it more as a hive where everybody's working together, shared goals, shared vision. And that's really when transformative growth can occur.
I love that. That does make me think in the metaphor though, like the beekeeper themselves is kind of removed and guarded. So how does that align with this idea of, purpose and heart and being part of the hive?
For sure. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, really, we're always learning about our book and people illuminate such new things to us each and every day that they're learning and experiencing, which is awesome. And that's kind of why we think the book has resonated with so many people is people are pulling things out and asking questions and we're like, oh, we never thought of it that way. But I do think it's important that that's the lens we're choosing to go into the book with like, hey, we had an idea, but people are using this book as they want to use it. And I do think the beekeeper, look, I think people naturally have been are afraid of bees. Like they kind of worry about oh my gosh, they're going to sting or I got to stay away from them and the beekeeper allows this environment where, they can just get right in there. And we have seen more recently people showing us if you're giving off really good pheromones and if you're, calm and you're bringing a calm to the hive that, not all beekeepers need to be protected, right? I think it's just precautionary. But Katie, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah. So I want to just kind of thread what Mike's saying. We actually just had this conversation with the beekeeper that we spent time with earlier this week. And, it's almost heartwarming to listen to her talk about her bees as her girls, right? So she's like, I have to go in and see my girls, right? And I have to make sure. And truly, right, this sense of, she said, if I let anything happen to my bees and I come back in the spring and a hive has died, I cry, right? Like I have such an emotional response to it. But two, reciprocally, they were telling us this story that, oftentimes what's healthy for bees, if a beekeeper passes away, that they have almost a ceremony where they invite the bees, right, to this, like, we are one, we are in this together. And so there's something, to Mike's point about the pheromones, right, that the beekeeper brings in giving off to, like, I am here to care for you. And in that space of shared mission and vision, like, let's grow together. Let me, and effective leaders do this, by the way, let me remove the obstacles and barriers out of your way to make you thrive, right? To help you do what you're here to do. And that's what effective beekeepers do, right? They move the obstacles out of the way. And to Mike's point earlier, create that environment that the bees can thrive. And so in that oneness, right, of course, they're communicating in different ways because it's an insect, right, and a human. But oh my goodness, how profound, right, when you watch that, kind of happen.
I love that. Very well answered. It's kind of a curveball of a question. Sorry for that.
No, that's okay. We love those.
So I love that you start with, a leader has to start with themselves. They've got to transform themselves first. And I wonder, is that hard when you have those conversations with leaders at the start? Or are there steps that are kind of baby steps you can take if you're just starting to realize, eeks, maybe I need to be making some of these changes first?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the way Mike answered the change management question earlier, is that, there are aha moments for us as humans, right? To sometimes it's easy to like point the finger, right? But it's harder to like turn the mirror to be like, oh, what am I doing? How am I influencing this? How am I choosing who and how to be in this situation? And so, Mike and I have been challenged in, kind of really modeling, right, this. And so if we're espousing, this is effective practice, this is right, then how do we enact that as leaders, right? To kind of see the, reciprocity of growth when we have that heightened awareness. But it really leans into that be mindset of be vulnerable. And sometimes people look at vulnerability as a weakness. And so, there's a lot of, education and process there in that, like, building a safe environment to say, no, this is actually courageous, right? To say my intentions were sound, but the impact that I was having was not. And so to recognize that intention and impact don't always align. And that gives us learning opportunities to adjust, right? Unlearn, make changes, and then, right, be able to progress. But if we want our people to do that, we have to be able to effectively do that as well.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes me think, in the book you mention like IQ, EQ, and BQ. And BQ is new for me, but could you explain kind of all three of those and how we as leaders kind of grow those capacities?
So IQ, right, really what we're learning, what we're unlearning, right, how we're encouraging, right, the intellectual quotient. EQ, right, our emotional quotient is about how we're connecting with others. And so when we really look at those 5 tenets of EQ, right, it's about self-awareness, you turning the mirror, right? But you having the motivation, the internal motivation to say, Mike and I might look at this a little different. Let me lean in. Let me listen to understand. Let me have the social skills to invite his voice in meaningful ways. And then, of course, in empathy, right, that we're listening to understand instead of listening to respond. And then finally, in the BQ space, that's our behavioral quotient. And so in all of the work that Mike and I do, right, for the last decade, we very much wanted it to be like, let's put it into action. How are we taking learnings and how do we immediately apply them, right? Let's not make it too complicated. Let's not make it like, you could get there a year from now, but like, what are the quick transfers to say, these are some small changes that I can make in my interactions that are really, really profound, that will help me and the people around me grow. And so when we think about the marriage, right, of IQ, EQ, BQ, that's ultimately the space of like why we do the work we do, right? Like, let's learn, let's understand the connection with humans. And then like in the behavior change, like let's model that and then allow others to come along the journey with us.
Yeah, well said. And you'd mentioned around individual growth, and I think all of these play a role in individual growth. But Katie talked about earlier the tri-level of leadership, right? So when you look inward and say, okay, how do I start understanding kind of in developing my own emotional intelligence, right? So I can be better. And then demonstrating the behaviors, which is even more important, not just the understanding, but actually the demonstration of the behaviors and putting them into practice at the individual level. You then see a huge impact at the group level, happening, and that be vulnerable kind of mindset of, someone or a leader demonstrating, there's an individual demonstrating these behaviors, allows it and creates the environment for other people to demonstrate those behaviors, which, really is where the transformation starts and begins.
So are the B mindsets kind of your framework for growing both EQ and BQ?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think, we're not limited in our B mindsets. We've chosen 15 in the book that resonate with us. And I think they are. It's like, who do you want to be, right? How do you want to show up? And that really goes into kind of the behavior piece. It's okay, I understand this about myself. I'm demonstrating emotional intelligence on this is how I show up each and every day. This is how my growth partner shows up. And so once you have that awareness, you then can kind of enact those behaviors, right? And even going back to like identifying shared B mindsets, like what do we both share that we want to kind of embrace and kind of move forward, almost like a shared vision, because that's when you can kind of enact those behaviors, in my opinion, more effectively.
And do you advocate then that everybody works on all 15 of the B mindsets, or is it more, these are my values, so these are the ones I'm going to be working on? Like, is it more of a pick and choose or more of a do it all, would you say?
So I think going back to Mike's point earlier, it's about the volition, right? You were not limited to the B mindsets that are in the book. The book illuminates that we have choices of who and how we want to be. And so on Catherine's journey, she was able to lean into those B mindsets, right? In spaces that like maybe previously she wouldn't have embraced, right? And so, Mike and I just had a conversation about the Be Patient chapter where Catherine's daughter in the book, Gabby, was fishing and her fishing line became tangled. And so there was a moment there like where we have a choice, right? We can have the quick fix and cut the line and start over, or we could have the one where we pause and we take a look at untangling the line, but to understand why it got tangled in the first place. And so there's meaningful learning moments that happen when we, are able to hit the pause button, right? Always going 1,000 miles per hour, to just be present and to understand why it happened, and let's do the thing, the things we have to not to make that happen again. And so when we're thinking about our B mindsets, I think that those can change, but it's about the heightened awareness of our choice, right? Having the agency to choose as humans who and how we want to be. So we can't control what happens around us, but we can control how we respond. And so how do we have that identification of, intentionally choosing who we want to be in those moments?
That's so cool. I was just listening to a meditation the other day, and it echoed a similar sentiment of like, we can be in a mood or the mood can be in us. And so much of getting out of a mood is recognizing like you're kind of in that tunnel. Yeah. I wonder which B mindset you both are working on at the moment. Is there one that really is resonating with you in your work and time?
Yeah, I know for me, one of the big ones for me is kind of the be messy. I'm typically a very structured person. My natural style and inclination is to have a process, and sometimes I don't like living in the unstructured world, but that's where we learn growth happens a lot. And so I'm just embracing the be messy mindset a lot. And vulnerability. I think be vulnerable, the other one for me is big right now. Doing this book and having the book, be so successful. We're getting a lot of requests for podcasts and keynotes and meetings, and just not a natural spot where I'm used to being, right? So getting out of your comfort zone again, allows you to demonstrate growth, but the be vulnerable is a big one.
You're doing great, Mike.
Oh, thanks.
How about you, Katie?
Be vulnerable for sure. It's like always the reminder that we're human and we have to lean in and learn. And to Mike's point, writing this book completely moved both of us out of our comfort zones. We've had goals for ourselves and we hit goals and then we're like, now what, right? We have to keep learning, right? Keep asking questions, keep saying, well, that didn't work. or we have to adjust and pivot. And so that's been a space of, it's exhilarating, but then there's also a place of like reminding yourself it's okay not to know. And it's okay to say like, we're still learning and we're still exploring.
Okay, a couple more nitty-gritty questions for you about leadership. What exactly does it mean to be proximal as a leader?
If you look at the pizza box that we had, it's be proximals on the top of the pizza box. I mean, that was like one of the first words we wrote, and proximal in and of itself, really means to place yourself at the center. It's a medical terminology, closest to the heart and the center of the body. So it's extremely important that people think about proximal in that way. Like, how do I place myself at the center of someone else's growth, at the center of someone else's, heart, where we can help them achieve kind of the things that they're wanting to achieve.
Beautiful. But how do you balance that? Like being at the center, being present, being helpful without becoming overbearing or feeling micromanaging? Do you find there's a tension there ever?
Finding someone who you can go on a growth journey with is really important. And I think being proximal requires someone that, is there to go on the ride with you, where they can challenge you, where they can, demonstrate authenticity, where you can be vulnerable, where they can tell you the things that you certainly, maybe don't want to hear about yourself. And so less about micromanaging, but more about being honest with people and allowing them to improve and grow and develop new skills to kind of enhance, their life. And there's got to be reciprocity there on both ends, I think is really important.
Yeah, Mike, Cindy, I just want to add to that because this came up in a recent keynote that we had is, in that space of feedback, sometimes people don't have the readiness to receive feedback. And so that comes in the space of like listening to understand,
yes.
Knowing that like intentions are, I want us to be better, right? So when we're giving and receiving feedback, there's a readiness of being able to take the feedback, right? And allowing it to help you. And so sometimes people misperceive, similar to bees, misperceive feedback as a bad thing. And so feedback is a gift. And so how do we create spaces where there's open communication, and to what Mike just shared, that there's reciprocity in the give and take of, right, being able to share, but being able to allow us to see things in ourselves that we don't see, right, that others do.
I just wrote a word big on my paper because I feel like it's a thread that's come up again and again in this conversation is intention. Of what is your intention where you're going? And people can feel that even if you're not being explicit. Like, do you find that as well, that just knowing your own intention, communicating that comes to be like one of the biggest parts of this being proximal piece?
Being very clear when you're placing yourself to some center of someone else's growth, like being really clear and explicit on like how they can get better, what they're seeing. You may be looking inward at yourself saying, I see this, and this is how I show up each and every day. But having someone else say, that's great, but this is how I'm seeing and the lens that I'm seeing this through, and really calling that out just makes you guys and everybody be more growth minded in the process.
Intention matters. But what's key is to make sure that intention and impact align. And so if my intentions, right, for Mike are to give Mike feedback to help him, but my feedback lands in a way that may feel hurtful, or, like he may lack motivation then to lean in, that's on me to adjust, right? To clarify, right, my intention, to make sure that it's landing in the way that it was intended. And so that's where the deep level diversity piece comes in, of when we're working with different, personality and behavioral attributes in people, which we do every single day, how we interpret, right, words into meaning differs. And so that we have to show up, right? And be curious and lean in. And so ensure that intention and impact align.
I love that. Well, and that feedback has to be mutual. Like people have to want feedback for it to be effective, and establishing that that's the relationship we're going to have. Mike, you use the term growth partners. So I know that's a term used in the book. Can you just clarify what you mean by a growth partner versus just the traditional employee-employer relationship?
Yeah, so when I think of growth partner, and I really think of like, someone like, Katie and I, right? We do see the world both very differently. Our personality styles are very different, right? But we have learned to kind of work together for the betterment of goal attainment, to better of professional and personal growth, understanding one another. And so, while an employee and employer could have a growth partnership, I think that's really important that they create that environment and a space where they can help others grow. And there's a lot of mentorships that go on. I think growth partnership really is different. And this new term that we're kind of coining is someone that's like really invested. It's not easy to have a growth partner. There are times where you have to tell someone stuff they don't want to hear. You have times that you have to, you may be upset with the feedback that you're getting, and you may not want to, may necessarily hear that feedback, right? But you take a moment and you recognize that this person is there to help you and make you better, and is giving you that feedback so you can grow. So what we encourage during our keynotes and our lectures is just take a moment and think about who in your life you have that relationship with that will go above and beyond to make sure that you're seeing things maybe differently, that you're unlearning maybe ways that you've done something that could be an inhibitor of growth, and then opening your ears to listen about yourself a little bit and hearing that same feedback. And so it's hard. A lot of people during our keynotes are like, I don't have someone like that in my life. I have a manager, or I have a family members. Those are all really important people that can all help be part of that in your growth. But there's got to be someone in your life who will help you get to kind of the next milestone of your personal and professional growth. And they're going to tell you the tough feedback sometimes.
So how do you find that person? Like, is it sometimes a matter of hiring a coach, or is it, again, are there any tips you have for finding that person in your life who can be your growth partner? I mean,
I'll tell you, Katie and I have worked together a long time, and maybe we didn't start off as growth partners. We started off as just colleagues, in academia, writing papers together. But there's a moment in time where you're hearing feedback and you're hearing things about yourself, and she's willing to tell you things that you may not see. And then you kind of recognize, like, yeah, I need this person in my life. I want them in my life because they're helping me grow and get better. And so I challenge, listeners or people all the time, like, who's that person that sometimes is telling you things you don't want to hear? And you're like, that's the person I want to stay closer to, right? Because they're pushing you out of your comfort zone, making you think, helping you think differently about the world, the way you may approach something. And those are the ones who help you can grow exponentially. So Katie, I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, Mike, you mentioned that we didn't start out as growth partners. And I think that's important for listeners to understand. So there's a pathway of trust building, right, over time, to Mike's point, right? That there is a readiness that, like, we can, like, lean in, listen to understand, really disagree, and then, like, come out better. Even when we think about how the book was born, right? It evolved over lots of conversations and disagreements and agreements, and right, to getting to and then we're both so excited about it, right? But those things take time. And so I think that there's a, level of, like, just the personal investment too, to put that in. And that comes down to really, we're often asked how teams can effectively collaborate. And we use bees, right, as the model to, like, how bees collaborate. But Mike and I, right, model that too. We see the world different. We could not be more different, like on, a DISC map of personality and behavioral, assessments of where we prioritize energy, our natural mindsets. But how do we show up? And I'm like, oh, Mike, interesting perspective. I would have never thought about it that way, right? And he's like, oh my gosh, Katie, thank you. Like, let me pause for a minute, right, and ask that question or go in. But again, it's like us kind of being that lens of, like, let me take Mike's lens for a minute and see the world, right? And him saying, like, let me put Katie's lens on, and see the world from that perspective. And then, how do we progress together, right? We do have shared goals and shared purpose in the work we do. We just sometimes would get there a different way without each other.
Are there routines you suggest? So if I have somebody, I'm thinking, this might be a person who's a growth partner. Are there questions I should be asking? Are there routines or structures that we should be putting in place to kind of foster that relationship?
Yes, Cindy, I love that you asked this question, because this conversation comes up a lot in, leadership development. In fact, last night I was teaching my graduate business class to, working professionals, and, thinking about leadership development. And in that space of routines, I always ask everyone to think about, like, what do you give your time and energy to? Because what we give our time and energy to grows. And so when we think about natural routines, right, we like to say, first, start with you, When we look at the tri-level of leadership, right? Individual starts with you. How are you investing in yourself? Get up, meditate, right? Maybe get some exercise, make sure that you're nourished. And then as you're connecting with others, right? How are you giving the time and energy to the people who help you grow? And so this is an exercise that I encourage people to do that I'm working with, is to say, like, if you're spending more time with people that are not helping you grow, I think you need to like scale back and be more intentional about putting those people on your calendar, right? Checking in, right? Spending time with the people that help you grow. And there's so many aha moments of like, oh my gosh, you're right. Right? Like I have this one individual that like I love to be with, but our lives are so busy. We'll get unbusy, right? And prioritize that time, because you'll see the benefits, right, of that investment, that time investment. But it's unlearning, right? We have to unlearn our bad habits, replace them with things that kind of fuel those returns.
I was thinking about this one as Katie was talking. You know, it's interesting we talk about routines. You know, I think I mentioned earlier that I'm working as one of my B mindsets to be less structured and more messy, right? And so for me, I think the routine of having a growth partner is really important. And I'm always thinking about like when and how to engage and what we're going to talk about. And so I like a little structure as we communicate, but you know, Katie is very natural at establishing relationships and just connecting with the human being. And I have to be a little more intentional about it. So that's just, again, going back to kind of our natural styles, right? And so I think the routine for me is getting me really good at making sure that it's not just business, right? It's not just about like talking about like a professional growth plan or the book or, you know, what we're doing. It's more talking about like, hey, how's your day going? And just being a human being. How are you as a human being? And that's not to come across as like, I don't care. I do care, but sometimes that's just not where my head goes naturally. So it's really helped me get in a routine of thinking about the human element first. And again, I mean, that probably wouldn't have happened without growth partnership, right?
And I've seen such growth, right, in Mike in that space, right, in the awareness. And then like what I have the internal motivation to like make the changes, but reciprocally, I could spend all day on the human element. But if I'm coming into a one-on-one with Mike, because Mike likes structure, I go in prior and I bullet out how I'd like to spend the time together, because I know that's meaningful in optimizing the way forward, right? And so we have to meet in the middle to know where like we have what we need to be successful, to feel supported, right? To feel that we're making progress. And so I think that, you know, to Mike's point earlier, there's reciprocity there of that, you know, stretch.
Right. And then I ask her how her day was, and it derails the entire bullet points all the time. So it's like I spend 30 minutes talking about the day, which is great. So I'm learning, she's learning. It's an amazing relationship.
Well, and what a perfect life example of the platinum rule you brought up earlier, that you might have different preferences and styles, but you're trying to accommodate each other with the shared intention of growth. I love that. I think, Mike, you and I might be a little bit similar. We're more like task system oriented. So is there like, just to push you a little, like a thinking routine or something that helps you get into that empathy space?
You know, it's funny you say that. It's been, it's like really starts at the beginning of the day, like just making sure you're checking in on the human being, making sure that, you know, what the plan is for the day. And whether that's with your growth partner, you know, people in your life, it's really important to start the day asking questions and being curious about, you know, what lies ahead for that person. So you can be mindful of the experience they may have over the next, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours. It's going to help me think through how I engage, you know, in a more human way. If you ask those questions in the beginning of the day versus being too task oriented.
So I think what Mike just shared is important. You know, and as he's demonstrating this, you know, these are things that he's aware of as a leader. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, these are things that you have to be aware of with a growth partner. These are things that as you're choosing who and how you want to be, right? Your growth partner helps you in that choosing who and how you want to be. But as a leader, right, when we're showing up, we have then that heightened awareness of our impact on others. And so there's a ripple, I think, of, you know, how that extends and expands into the people we touch throughout the day.
So much of your work centers on this idea of individual growth. And I wonder the connections that you see between individual growth and collective efficacy and agency. Because, you know, we're all familiar with Hattie's work he said collective efficacy is the number one change agent in student performance. If we as teachers feel a sense of collective efficacy and agency, our schools change. So what's the connection there between personal growth and collective efficacy?
Yeah. So, and we're seeing this in schools who have adopted our book. Is there's individual, and actually in one of the schools we were just in, they have hexagons on their doors, right? Which are the pieces of the honeycomb. So the individual piece of the honeycomb is one individual hexagon. And on that hexagon, right, is like their B mindsets as individuals. But when you put all the hexagons together and you look at all of the collective B mindsets of everyone, we're able then to lean in and support one another. And so in the spirit of creating a thriving hive, we have to acknowledge the individual, right? And how that individual contributes to the larger whole, right? To help us just realize what we could do, our big potential when we do it together.
That is, for me, the key takeaway from this is just grow yourself, know yourself, grow yourself. And everything else kind of becomes easier if you have that mindset going into it. Okay, I've got one last question for you. And I'm wondering, you both manage change in really different settings. So I'm curious if you had one piece of advice for how we really fuel growth and change in our learning communities, what would be your biggest tip, your biggest aha?
I think a recognition that change needs to happen and an awareness of, the culture in the organization. Oftentimes, culture can get away from us as growth happens. And I think one piece of advice would be to know the culture and make sure that leaders are, setting the culture, but also including those, in the hive, for lack of a better term, or around them to help contribute to that collective culture. Once that gets away, it's very hard to kind of rebuild culture. So I think an awareness of what the culture is, why it's that way, and having buy-in from those around you is extremely important to effectively, execute any change in an organization.
Mike's identifying, right, the environment matters. And so we're not growing in an environment that is not encouraging ongoing learning and growth. We're not growing in an environment that feels unsafe, right? And so we're mindful of that culture, right? That environment that we are creating to encourage ongoing learning and growth. And so to Mike's point, we have to be able to see those opportunities in the environment to make changes, right? To make it a safe space that encourages that, ongoing learning and growth.
Well, I think that this book is full of so many ahas. I think if leaders haven't added it to their list this year, it should be at the top. And I'm just so appreciative that you've taken the time out today to share all of your insights with our community.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Cindy. Thanks for having us.